Hello, students. Today we are going to discuss about Matthew Arnold, the Victorian critic. Arnold, who was a great poet as well as a critic of that period, was a great intellectual and a cultural icon. His critical writings began with preface to the poem in 1853, and his other writings of the critical literature are on translating Homer, 1861, the study of Celtic literature, 1867, essays in criticism in two series, 65 and 1888, and his culture and anarchy, that is 1869. So, as a critic, Arnold is generally considered as a socio-ethical critic. That means he discussed and defined the relation of critic to the society, as well as he also wrote about the art of poetry, and in this manner he gave important contribution towards both literature and society. And his best ideas for the promotion of the cause of culture is known to everyone. Most of us, we know him as a great advocate of culture. And what are the different characteristics of Arnold as a critic? If we look at the various impressions about Arnold from different scholars and critics, we can find certain characteristic within Arnold's critical life. So, what are they? The first thing we can definitely find in Arnold is that his manner and style. That means he always was able to keep the reader absorbed in his presentation of the ideas, and at the same time he was also able to keep them at a distance. He never wanted to identify the reader or himself with the ideas, but at the same time he wanted that these ideas should be the part of our manner, our mannerism. And secondly, we can say that his style was biographical in presenting his ideas along with his experiences, which was very suitable for the Victorian mind. And thirdly, he also presents a scientific attitude where and he evolves the critical theory as a rational or scientific process of examining and appreciating the poetic creativity. Fourthly, we can say that Arnold exactly didn't subscribe to the intellect as the sole criteria of critical faculty, but also he wanted to take the middle path by being on equal distance between pure rationalism on one side and the emotion or subjectivity on the other side. Therefore, his reason is called as imaginative reason. It is a blend of both. And finally, we can say that his approach to criticism, his approach to literature or its analysis exhibits a wider scope. He's not focusing on the particular aspects that we have found in the conventional critical theories. Rather, he goes beyond these scopes to find out the elements that can make critical study an interesting and wholesome experience. Then, where can we put Arnold as a critic? Arnold as a critic fits into the classical structure. In spite of the developments in his critical ideas over the old classical theories, we can put him under the classical category because he broadly rejected the romantic theories. The romantic theories which preceded him or which preceded the Victorian period was rejected by him because he believed that England being the native home of intellectual eccentricity of all kind, it is better that we should approach creativity from a classical perspective. Therefore, we can say that he was greatly influenced by the Hellenism that was coming from the period of Plato and Aristotle, and with his classical approach, he blended very well the of culture and manner which was very much suitable for the Victorian period, which was suitable to the Victorian prudery, as we know. So, now coming to our syllabus, we have of his theories, one part of his theory that deals with Touchstone method, high seriousness they are coming from is the study of poetry and the grand style criticism of life, all these things, they are being taken from his another say more. So first of all, we will discuss about concept of criticism and creation. And because this is critical theory that we are discussing here, and Matthew Arnold is a great critic with great area of coverage. So I will take time by going through the text thoroughly and elaborating the things. Therefore, you must have the patience, and it may take few sessions, but still, I think it will be helpful to you in your exams. So, now we are going into the text. Arnold writes, the future of poetry is immense because in poetry, where it is worthy of its high destinies, our race, as time goes on, will find an ever surer and surer stay. There is not a creed which is not an dogma which is not shown to be questionable, not a received tradition which doesn't threaten to dissolve. Our religion has materialized itself in the fact, in the supposed fact. It has attached its emotion to the fact, and now the fact is failing it. So, Arnold is telling that we English people in this Victorian era, we have marched a long way from our beginning, and already we have come across so many developments in every sphere, from the dogmatic past to the rational present, by going through several movements in religion as well as various innovations and developments in the methods of tradition. So he's telling there was a time when religion was attaching the emotion to the fact. That means religion was the primary source of our knowledge. We believed in religion, but religion was not factual, or even if it was presenting the facts, most of the facts were under the influence of emotion. But now that is also falling out. That means he is talking about the Victorian crisis, the emergence of science or scientific temper that was shaking the foundations of dogmatic religion. Then he is telling, but for poetry, the idea is everything, the rest is a world of illusion, of divine illusion. Poetry attaches its emotions to the idea is the fact. So he is emphasizing that in poetry, idea is everything. Already we have discussed whether it is Coleridge or Horace or even our Sydney, all are talking about idea, the importance of idea in poetry. So Arnold is also talking about idea in poetry. He is telling that idea is everything, rest is a world of illusion, of divine illusion, and whatever there in this world beyond idea, these are all illusion. So poetry attaches its emotion to the idea. So if poetry is an expression of emotion, then this emotion is not a blind emotion. This emotion is not a confused emotion, but this emotion is attached to a certain idea. The poet is guided by one idea, and he is emoting the idea, or he is trying to attach the emotions to the idea. The idea becomes the fact. As religion converted the emotions into fact, so poetry is also converting the the idea into the fact. Therefore, he is telling the strongest part of our religion today is its unconscious poetry. So, in Victorian England, the religion relies on unconscious poetry. That means unconscious ideas, the ideas which were there behind, about which the religion itself is not very conscious. So, in this way, he is telling that idea is the most significant aspect of poetry. Then he is telling we should conceive of poetry worthily and more highly than it has been the custom to conceive of it. We should conceive of it as capable of higher uses and called to higher destinies. So he is telling, then what is the function of poetry? The function of poetry, because it uses the ideas, so the function of poetry is to be capable of using our ideas in higher use, to take our general ideas or ordinary ideas into extraordinary uses. So, how an ordinary idea can be used in extraordinary manner? When emotion will be attached to it. So, he is telling without poetry, our science will appear incomplete, and most of what now passes with us as for religion and philosophy will be replaced by poetry. So he is telling, in this manner, what happens? Idea emerges as the most significant part of human consciousness. And when it is the most significant part of human consciousness, so our science is incomplete, because science also deals with ideas. So science will remain incomplete if it cannot use poetry, because within poetry there are the ideas. And here poetry means not only the poems but all literature. So he's telling, whatever in Victorian age we are conceiving as religion and philosophy, they all will be replaced by poetry in the coming days. Why? Because religion is using ideas, poetry is using ideas, but poetry is using the ideas in transcending the ordinary to the extraordinary use, and religion is making it dogmatic, so to say, blinding the ideas to a limitation of belief. Philosophy is also using the idea, but philosophy is using the idea in a vague manner, in a manner that ordinary people can have no use for it. Therefore, Arnold is making a comparison between philosophy, religion, and science, and he is telling poetry is the best use of ideas, the human ideas. Okay. So now he is elaborating that, and he is telling in poetry, which is thought and art in one, it is the glory, the eternal honor. So he is telling if poetry is capable of fulfilling higher destinies, so poetry must be a high order of excellence. If poetry is able to fulfill our human ideas in the most suitable and higher manner, then definitely it is high order of excellence. Nothing is more excellent than poetry. And if it is the high order of excellence, then it is thought and art in one. It is the blending of, it is the unification of thought. Thought is idea, and art is emotion, embellishment through emotion, and it is the glory. Therefore, it is the glory, it is the supreme, because poetry blends both thought and emotion to elevate human mind, to inspire human mind. So it is the glory of mankind, the eternal honor. And he is telling that charlatanism is for confusing or obliterating the distinctions between excellent and inferior, sound and unsound, or only half sound, true and untrue, or only half true. It is charlatanism, conscious or unconscious. Whenever we confuse or obliterate these, and in poetry, more than anywhere else, it is unpermissible to confuse or obliterate them. Now he is coming to again compare poetry with charlatanism, and charlatanism means the cleverness, the smartness. We sometimes say that this fellow is very smart, and we appreciate. But smartness is something different from what is a very good or an adorable or appreciable quality. So Arnold is, because we call Arnold as the socially conscious critic. Excuse me. So he's telling charlatanism is for confusing or obliterating. It confuses man, or it obliterates our ideas or memories, and it works between excellent and inferior, and it takes out the distinction. We forget to know what is excellent and what is inferior. A smart person can be a smart cheater. He cheats, and sometimes we say without knowing, oh, how he cheats. We are pleased, we are happy, but at that moment we don't know that that is immoral. So Arnold, being a Victorian, was very much conscious about morality. So he is telling charlatanism is obliterating the distinction between half sound, sound, true, untrue, conscious, unconscious, excellent, inferior. These can be asked for 2 marks. But poetry, more than anywhere else, is unpermissible to confuse or obliterate. Poetry is not charlatanism. Poetry never confuses. The distinction between these two extremes, and particularly between morality and immorality. For in poetry, the distinction between excellent and inferior, sound and unsound, or only half sound, true and untrue, or only half true, is of paramount importance. Poetry always makes it distinct that something is excellent, something is inferior, something is sound, something is unsound, something is untrue, and something is only half true. Poetry deals in distinction of our thoughts, our ideas. It clarifies to us our moralities, our moral learnings, moral trainings, our moral obligations to the society. Therefore, in poetry, as in criticism of life, under the conditions fixed for such a criticism by the laws of poetic truth and poetic beauty, the spirit of our race will find. We have said, as times goes on and other helps fail, its consolation and stay. So, he is telling, even if there will be a crisis in the world, when human knowledge, when all these human achievements like philosophy, history, science, they may falter, they may fail, they may fail to give us a clear direction, a clear conscience. But poetry will never. Poetry will never give us that confusion. Poetry will always give us a clear direction. And the criticism of life will be of power in proportion as the poetry conveying it is excellent rather than inferior, sound rather than unsound or half sound, true rather than untrue or half true. So he is telling criticism of life will be of power in proportion as the poetry conveys. So poetry is a criticism of life. It is critical of life. It critically presents the life in different categories. And in doing so, poetry teaches us various steps of life, various modalities of living experiences, and the distinctions between them. Then, in page 189, the second paragraph is telling the best poetry is what we want. The best poetry will be found to have a power of forming, sustaining, and delighting us as nothing else can. So now he is coming to the poetry and he is telling what is the best poetry. He is telling the best poetry has the power. Poetry is not powerless. Poetry is a very powerful tool in the hands of man. And it has a great power of forming, sustaining, and delighting. It forms our mind. It sustains our zeal of life. And it delights our mind to have the experience of life. And he is telling no other human endeavor, knowledge, or achievement can give us these three powers in such a high standard as poetry. A clearer, deeper sense of the best in poetry and of the strength and joy to be drawn from. It is the most precious benefit which we can gather from a poetical collection such as the present. So he is telling these directions of life, these pleasures of life, these shaping or forming experiences of life can only be got from the poetry. And which poetry? because already I have told you that he was not in favor of romantic ideas. So he is talking about the Victorian poetry. Then in page 190, he is talking about the constant reading of poetry, and he is telling constantly in reading poetry, a sense for the best, the really excellent, and of the strength and joy to be drawn from it should be present in our minds and should govern our estimate of what we read. So, if we regularly read poetry, then what will happen? He is telling that they will be really excellent for strengthening our joy, giving us joy, calming our minds, and at the same time also creating within us a sense of making distinction between the real and the other one, the true and the half true, etc. So he is telling, if we are not watchful by two other kinds of estimate, the historic estimate and the personal estimate, both of which are fallacious. So he is telling, but at the same time, what happens? That when we are reading the poetry, we should not be superseded by two estimates, the historic estimate and the personal estimate. That means, as a critic, he is telling, when we are reading poetry, how should we judge poetry? We should not judge poetry by its historic estimate, when that poem was written, the time, the movement, all those things, they are not suitable for estimating a poetry, for analyzing a poetry. Similarly, the personal estimate, the personal biographical elements of the poet are not necessary to analyze or evaluate poetry. A poem was written by Wordsworth, so immediately we take an idea who was Wordsworth, what are the characteristics, then we try to discover those things in poetry. That should be banished. We should not take that into account while estimating a poetry. Or we should not also estimate whether this poetry was written during a particular historical period. So it must be having such and such characteristics. Therefore, he is telling a poet or a poem may count to us historically, they may count to us on grounds personal to ourselves, and they may count to us really. They may count to us historically, our personal affinities, likings, etc., etc., to make us attach more importance to it as poetry than in itself it really possesses. So, if we give importance to these personal and historic estimates, then what will happen? Instead of giving the importance to its poetry, we will be giving importance to these estimates, and thus we will be creating a fallacious idea, a false idea about that particular poetry. And thus we get the source of a second fallacy in our poetic judgment, the fallacy caused by an estimate which we may call personal. So he is telling both these estimates, they create a sense of fallacy in our estimate of poetry. So now what we find, that Coleridge is talking about how to approach poetry, how to evaluate poetry. Then what is the true method of evaluating poetry? He is telling, indeed, page number 191, last paragraph, indeed, there can be no more useful help for discovering what poetry belongs to the class of the truly excellent and can therefore do us most good than to have always in one's mind lines and expressions of the great masters and to apply them as a touchstone to other poetry. So he is telling that to analyze a poetry, we must apply the touchstone method. He is the person who gave this idea to literary criticism, the touchstone method. You know the touchstone? Touchstone means the stone with the goldsmiths. What they do? They, if you take some gold, old jewelry to him, he will rub that jewelry on that touchstone, make a mark, and he will be rubbing a pure gold with him. Though we know they all cheat us, but they will show that our gold is inferior. So he is telling we can use the same method, but not by using a stone here. Rather, by comparing the best poetry, already accepted best poetry in our history, with the new poetry. Some lines, some stanzas, some expressions, some imageries. If we can compare it with the best poets and their poetry, then we can make a proper judgment of the poetry, the new poetry. So that is his touchstone method. And why he is telling that? Because already he told that personal estimate and historical estimate should not be the criteria in judging poetry. And in this way, he gives us this touchstone method by which we have to make a comparison. And he is telling critics give themselves great labor to draw out what in the abstract constitutes the characters of a high quality of poetry. It is much better simply to have recourse to concrete examples, to take specimens of poetry of the very highest quality, and to say the characters of a high quality of poetry are what is expressed there. So he is telling why the Touchstone method? Because critics sometimes do a great labor, and they try to find out some abstract constitutes in the character of poetry. But it is better if we can take concrete examples by taking these old, proved great poetry and compare them. Then the characters of high quality of the new poetry can be evaluated. Arnold brings out his own method of estimating poetry.